Welcome to Middleweight Politics, political analysis for the independent voter. I am one half of your co-hosting duo, Dan Sally.
I'm Sean Griffiths.
And if you are one of the majority of Americans who does not identify with either party, if you are one of the majority of Americans who thinks it's time to have more than two choices on the ballot, and if you are one of the Americans who sees politics in colors other than red and blue, welcome home, my purple people. Now, last week, former president, now president-elect, and soon-to-be president in real life again, Donald Trump announced his first picks for cabinet. Oh boy, that's all I have to say about that. We're going to talk about that and how media has created made-for-TV politics at the expense of policy. But first, Sean, I forgot how exhausting this guy was.
Oh yeah,
we're less than a week past the election.
Well, and we've talked about this before, how I prefer to have a president that I don't have to think about on a daily basis. Just do your job in Washington, but I don't really even want to hear your name on a daily basis. Like, I don't care to hear it on a daily basis, as long as you're not doing a horrible job and you're not, setting fire to stuff. I'm good. But with Trump, it's going to be one of those things, just like with the first administration, where we're going to hear his name every single day.
All the time. It's, no president is perfect. And there's probably a lot of nefarious things that have gone on in the background in a number of other administrations.
Mm-hmm.
But they weren't lighting off fireworks every time they did it.
Right.
Like, they did it. So if you're going to screw us over, please do it quietly and move on. Just get out of my face. There was an interesting piece of good news I wanted to start off on because I think it dovetails quite well into what we're going to talk about. And that is the re-election of David Valadao in California. So
yes.
For those of you, so you heard this story. So for those of you unfamiliar, David Valadao is one of a handful of Republicans who voted to impeach Donald Trump after the January 6th attack. He is one of, I think, two House Republicans who survived a primary challenge. And this time around, Democrats spent millions of dollars in a fruitless effort to defeat him, which actually seems kind of quaint given Kamala Harris spent $1 billion to lose. But this is a district that leads 10 points in the favor of Democrats. And he has managed to hold on to office. And one of the mechanisms that's allowed Valadao to stay in office this long has been the top two primary system in California, which you and I have talked about before, Sean.
Right. So in post-election, you hear the phrase a lot, elections have consequences. But I would argue in the U.S. that should be amended to primary elections have consequences, because more than anything with most elections in the United States, the most consequential election is the primaries. And so in a state like California or Alaska, you're seeing a stark contrast from the rest of the country, right, in terms of what representation ends up looking like. And so the incentive that we're seeing in California, particularly in a district like Valadao's, is to not be so extreme. Because when you are a Republican in a Democrat plus 10 district, you have to be able to appeal to not just Republicans, but independents and moderate Democrats who are fine with your representation, right? They're okay voting for a person of another party as long as that representation looks good for them, right? Personally. This is a stark contrast from what you would see elsewhere, where a Republican in a D plus 10 district first has zero chance of winning in other districts across the country, but also doesn't have that same incentive, because in their party primary, they have to appeal to party members specifically in low turnout elections, which end up drawing in even a small percentage of those party members to begin with.
Yeah, that's spot on. So again, to refresh everyone's memory, California's top two primary system means that all candidates from all parties compete in an open primary, and the top two vote getters ultimately make it on the ballot. So sometimes in California, you'll have two Democrats, sometimes you'll have two Republicans, but either way, it is all voters who are going to participate in the November election determine who their two favorites are, rather than the standard primary process where each party gets together and the most partisan voters select two options that the majority of voters may not be all that happy with.
Right.
And so it's a great way to reduce polarization. I think one of the interesting quotes I pulled from an article covering this in Politico was from GOP strategist Rob Stutzman. And the thing he said is he's not extreme, he's focused on getting the work done. And the last line, which I found especially relevant to what we're going to talk about, he's not there to build a profile to get clicks or become Fox News famous. So this is a guy that focuses on the needs of his district and what the majority of voters are thinking, and isn't so focused on what the partisan base is thinking about at any given point in time.
Mm-hmm. I find it interesting because in Arizona, obviously the nonpartisan primary initiative there failed, Prop 140, but one of the opponents said that, most voters, they fall left or right anyway. So you don't want a system that is going to incentivize and encourage candidates or going to produce candidates who fall more to the center, which is very telling how partisans understand that nonpartisan primary systems do lead to less extreme candidates getting elected. But it's also one of those things where you could dispute that claim, because not necessarily that voters are more moderate. I tend to agree. I think a lot of voters do fall on the left, right of the political spectrum, but they are looking for candidates who, to that quote, are there to get things done. They are
Yeah.
in Washington, they're in their state capital to get things done, which is lacking in much of the country.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, if you're only serving Coke and Pepsi,
Right.
do you really know if people don't want water?
Mm.
I think the two-party system corrals people into these thought channels, and we have these coalitions of people who are either really for a given party or really not for the opposition party. And we talked about this in the last episode. When you have the not for contingent and you put them together, they're a sizable chunk of the electorate. So about a third of all voters in the most recent presidential election were voting against a candidate, not for one. And I would
Mm-hmm.
argue that those people are just as turned off by the extremes of the party that they ultimately helped elect as they are by the extremes of the party that they voted for.
Oh, absolutely. In a lot of cases, you look at states with partisan primary systems, and I agree. I think even when you look at a lot of Republicans or a lot of Democrats, they would like to vote for the less extreme candidate. But when you have low turnout primaries and that extreme fringe is able to rally just enough voters to get out and vote for their candidate, then a lot of these partisan members, these party members, are stuck with this situation where, okay, I can either vote for the person with my letter next to the name, or I can vote against my party, which a lot of them choose not to do at the end, because ultimately, even the more extreme candidate is going to be closer to what they're interested in from a candidate anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, well, even up here, so I'm in Boston, so I get advertising from New Hampshire, and there was advertising during the most recent presidential campaign,
Mm-hmm.
and it was talking about securing the border, and it's just like, which border? Like Canada? Like, you couldn't be further. Like, there's one state further away from Mexico than you. Actually, two, because we have Alaska. But in the continental United States,
Mm-hmm.
you have one other state that's further away from Mexico on the East Coast.
Yeah.
So it encourages people to mobilize around issues that really may not affect them all that much.
Mm-hmm.
And like, great example, men competing in women's sports. It's like the only time anybody seems to care about women's sports is when there's the potential for a trans person to be in there. And I mean,
Right.
I have zero opinion. I don't care.
I have zero opinion on that myself. You're looking at a very small percentage of the population to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And when you think of how the percentage of a population that becomes athletes, you're taking an even smaller percentage of a small percentage of the
Yeah,
population. So for me, it's just, it doesn't have the numbers or even relevancy to be an issue.
yeah, 100%. But yet everybody talks about it.
Right,
And
right.
so, again, because of the two party system, because of the media ecosystem, everybody talks about these issues that may not always land at the kitchen table,
Mm.
uh, which I think segues very nicely into, I think, the main topic of this episode, which is Trump's most recent round of cabinet picks, which I think surprised a lot of people. So we've got a whole slew of folks. I don't know if you want to go through them one by one. I've got my take on them.
The more interesting picks, I think, would be because I think there are some, okay, this is kind of normal ish, like a Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. That's probably not the go to choice, but it seems like a normal politician pick. And I think you're right. I think a lot of people were surprised. Some people say you shouldn't be surprised by this, but Trump in 2016, his cabinet was made of people who fit the roles. They may not be a person that you would want in that role or agree should be in that role, depending on your point of view. But they were pretty par for the course in terms of what one might expect. But now it's, you got Fox News hosts and you got Matt Gaetz, who is like for Attorney General. Like, I'm still, it's still shocking to me that he was picked. But yeah, it's taken me aback with some of these choices.
Yeah, I mean, I was probably most surprised by Rubio just because he has actual experience. I
Yeah.
half expected like the animatronic Thomas Jefferson from Disney World to get the nod for Secretary of State at the rate this was going. Pete Hegseth, Fox News host, nominated Secretary of Defense. Here's my idea. Let's just take all of Fox News, every Fox News TV personality, and just staff the cabinet with them, and then staff Fox News with people who actually know what they're talking about. And this problem will be resolved in a year. Because from the last Trump presidency, it's pretty obvious who he listens to. Then we've got Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy, tapped to lead the Department of Government Efficiency. Yeah, I mean, we have the person who owns X, and then someone who talks like a walking version of the platform. I honestly think that out of all the surprises that came last week, that actually interested me the most because I think it could be effective.
Mm-hmm.
There's a pretty level headed, nonpartisan think tank called the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. They released a statement endorsing the idea of a department to look at efficiency in government. They're obviously budget
Mm-hmm.
hawks. And I think there's merit to it. For example, each branch of the armed services does their own procurement. There's a question as to whether they could benefit from consolidating that by virtue of economies of scale. But the other thing to take into consideration is where are they going to target? Because the federal workforce, so these are people who are employed by the federal government, cost $271 billion in 2022. That's about 2.3 million workers, about 1.5% of the total US workforce. Not a small amount of money.
Right.
694 billion was spent on contractors outside. And so my question is, when they look at these cuts, are they going to be federal employees who represent a smaller portion of the budget but could be considered the deep state?
Mm-hmm.
Or are they going to go after these contractors who not only represent a bigger expense but probably a more powerful lobby?
So there's a video of Vivek Ramaswamy talking about this and floating the idea that, well, he thinks it's as easy of a solution as what you could do is just look at everybody's social security numbers, and if their social security ends in an even number, you keep them, and if it ends in an odd number, you fire them. So he proposed basically Thanos snapping the federal government, and this because then he said, well, then it's not biased. You're not, you don't have to have concerns about whether racial discrimination or gender discrimination is on the table or even can be considered if you just randomly do it. But at the same time, then you're not basing it on merit or what that person's role actually brings to the federal government.
Yeah. The way it's portrayed is that it's an easy solution. We're going to go in, we're going to find the best performers or the people who have the odd numbered social security numbers, and we're just going to get rid of them and lower expenses. The majority of expense, or the majority of our federal budget, and the majority of what's adding to the deficit is social security and Medicare. You can't balance the federal budget without cutting non-defense discretionary, without cutting defense spending, without cutting social security, without cutting Medicare, and without raising taxes. You need to do all of those things in order to balance the budget and reduce the deficit. And all of them are political suicide. And as long as the debt markets are willing to finance our spending, there's going to be no political cost. And I think what's going to happen, and we're already seeing this, is that interest payments on the debt, the cost of carrying that debt, is going to become a larger and larger portion of our federal budget, and it's going to crowd out a lot of other spending. Yeah, I could go on. There's one question I want to ask you, though, about Trump's cabinet picks, and that's, who do you think is the first one that's going to get fired? Because somebody's going to get fired, right?
That's a great question, but also, like, I think even before you get to that, this raises an interesting question about who's willing to seriously look at these candidates, and when the time comes, and with like Matt Gaetz, for instance, there's a lot of talk about how there's even plenty of Republicans who might vote against that confirmation. And so the interesting question becomes, how many Republicans are willing to, go against Trump at this point in the Senate when it comes to these confirmations. And the interesting thing about that is, there's already been conversations on X from people who have threatened senators, saying that if you do not vote for Trump's picks, whether it's Gates or whether it's Gabbard or whether it's Kennedy, that we are going to primary you, which speaks to what we were saying before about the consequences of primary elections, and how in a party primary system that exists in most of the states, the primaries can be weaponized. They can be weaponized by party bosses. They can be weaponized by organized grassroots movements that have enough people to bring out to the polls. And very small majorities, or very small percentages of the population too, can do this in much of the country, which is why we clarify the contrast between what a nonpartisan primary system can do versus what a party primary system can do.
Mm-hmm.
Because Valadeo, he's not in the Senate, but they couldn't threaten him with that. They can't say, well, we're going to primary you if you don't vote for the confirmations.
You're exactly right there, and this highlights a much bigger issue, which is, I think, fragmented media has created this situation where people can gain power over the parties through their audience.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you take a look, if we go way back, Rush Limbaugh was actually the first one to do this, I think, with any great effect. He was somebody who could really command the conservative voting bloc. But as the internet started to open up room for more channels, as Fox News became a thing, as conservative media became stronger, and liberal media for that matter, I don't want to just focus on the conservative side here. What you had was the rise of almost personality-driven politics that opened up threats for politicians who wanted to stand against the partisan media establishment, but also present opportunities for politicians who were feckless enough to play to the pundits. And if we look now, I'll pick folks on both sides without assigning value judgment, you have AOC on the left. Her power comes from her visibility on social media, her ability to generate controversy. Same with Marjorie Taylor Greene, right? And two of them are two of the most successful small dollar donors in their parties. So not only do they have the ability to turn the rank and file of their party against their own, but they're also tremendous fundraisers, which gives them a lot of cachet within their own respective parties. And so, in a lot of ways, the media system has weakened the party's ability to enforce discipline. And the primary system really enables that.
Right. The primary system itself has helped facilitate the hyper-polarized environment that we have today.
Mm-hmm.
So more and more over the years, and it's not just a recent thing, right? This has been going on for decades. The parties have more and more entrenched themselves behind their own party label. And so, regardless of what you think of Rush Limbaugh, he might have been a bit prophetic in the way that he approached his own show by targeting, specific ideological groups, specific niche groups, and speaking to them directly, because he could see that, as the parties pull further and further apart, you are going to see increased fractures in the way that people talk to each other, the way they communicate, the way that the media handles political stories, the way that campaigns and candidates talk about stories and elevate non-issues as opposed to, speaking directly to policy needs and interest. And so, yeah, I absolutely agree that when you look at what is the catalyst to this, you can look at the current, partisan political system we have.
It's interesting. We're talking about open primaries, and I think it's important that we make some distinctions here,
Mm-hmm.
because I think one of the things that's often overlooked is that Trump's initial success in 2016 was due to open partisan primaries, right?
Right.
Trump performed better in states with open primaries. And the reason for that is that he was, I think, one of the first, at least on the Republican side, who was able to bypass traditional media and speak directly with voters via Twitter. And this created the perception of direct access. The word I've heard that I really like is parasocial relationship. These people felt like they had a real relationship with Trump. And his unfiltered way of speaking gave this appearance of authenticity. And so not only was he able to continue to grow his following without the help of traditional media, without the help of his party's establishment, but he was also able to say things no other politician could say and actually strengthen his case when he did it. And I brought up this example last week. I'm going to say it again for anyone who didn't have a chance to listen to it, but it's identical to the strategy Southwest Airlines used, where Southwest Airlines targeted bus passengers and ultimately was able to eat into the major airlines' market share as a result. Trump targeted low propensity voters. He targeted voters who lived outside of standard political media,
Mm-hmm.
right? You even see this
Right.
with the most recent Republican convention where you had Hulk Hogan up there, right? He goes, he has
Right.
rallies. It's all designed for people who like the spectacle of Trump. And that is why he has such a fervent following. And that's why he can do things no other politician can do. And in 2016, he capitalized on the fact that there was a fractured Republican field with, I don't remember how many candidates, a lot. And he just kind of took them out one by one.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what this tells us is, with the change in media, what we have to think about is how do we adjust the structures
Mm-hmm.
in elections so people can't just, like, pardon the phrase, shitpost their way into office, which is really what's kind of happened.
Right. And I think this again gets back to the contrast that we made between what a nonpartisan open primary system can do versus even what a partisan open primary can do. Because when I talk about partisan primaries, I'm not just talking about closed systems, I'm talking about open systems as well, because these are systems that from the beginning incentivize a fractured media, incentivize a fractured electorate that's already divided between two sides. But now you're fracturing those sides even more by having them pick between specific candidates of a single party. And so, yes, that allows for candidates to speak to certain audiences and speak directly to them to get them and show up in the polls in the case of an open partisan primary system to vote for you. And Trump did that very successfully in 2016. I will note, though, that as he took command of the Republican Party, he started to understand how open partisan primaries could hurt him, especially as he was losing support among independents. So in 2024, his position on that has shifted radically. He is now openly in favor of closed primary systems because now he has his audience, and now when you can close the process, you can more easily target it. And
Yeah.
I think what benefit a nonpartisan system has is that you've opened the pool to all voters completely, which means you can't just do that. You can't just target one niche group in order to be successful. You have to have a more broad message if you want to advance. But the issue, and I'll speak to this very quickly. The issue that we've run into in this regard for reform is that even in California and Alaska, those nonpartisan systems don't exist in the presidential election because the parties have asserted their private right to pick their own presidential nominees. And because of how that system is structured, that ultimately gives them full control over how presidential elections are conducted.
And I don't see that changing. I would love to say that the Republicans who've sort of been shunned for opposing Donald Trump, like the Romneys and the Cheneys, and maybe those who are still in Trump's circle but aren't so comfortable with the way he acts, I would love to think that they would try to figure out ways to dampen the Trump effect in primaries. I don't see any evidence of that. I also don't see any evidence of the Democrats wanting to do anything to reduce their power. And I think if I'm going to give a call to action to you listening or watching this, it's that reforming elections can be done at the state level. We don't need to elect certain people into Congress to make this happen. It's not easy, but if people organize at the state level, they can have a real impact. And I really think that if you're part of that group that maybe isn't so hot about the Republicans and isn't so hot about the Democrats, maybe you find yourself voting against the opposition party rather than voting for the party in power. This is a great place to channel your energy. So you don't just have to vote for the lesser of two evils. You can also push for reforms that are going to open up the Coke and Pepsi market to, I don't know, Dr. Pepper, Mountain Dew, take your pick. We can start to open up this closed market, but it does not happen without ordinary voters taking action. The parties aren't going to do it.
And unfortunately, it's not going to happen overnight either, as we saw in this last election, where you had 6 statewide initiatives for nonpartisan primary reform fail. And one of the critical reasons why is because there wasn't enough grassroots movement behind these reforms to start with and build from, along with a comprehensive voter education system that should have existed long before even signatures were gathered to put these initiatives on the ballot. It's important for voters to understand that to see reform, to see change, it's going to take time. It requires patience. You have to start by joining a local group, right? And building from that local group until you have a network that can ultimately bolster a statewide movement to get these type of initiatives passed. It's what California did with Top Two. They focused for months before they actually started gathering signatures on voter education specifically, and reaching out through all mediums that they had to reach the voters for that voter education process.
Mhm.
And the result is that it passed. And in Alaska, I don't think they had as strong of a grassroots effort, which is why right now you're seeing very close elections to both put in place nonpartisan reform, but this year keep it. At the time of this recording, Measure 2, which would repeal nonpartisan primary reform, has not been decided. It is 50.5 to 49.5, and with still 30,000 votes to count as at the time of this recording. So by the time this episode releases, we may know the fate. But again, it speaks to how important just building that grassroots from the bottom up is for this movement.
If there's one thing I am certain of, it's that in another 4 years, Americans are going to still be unhappy with the direction of the country.
Yeah.
Right? This is the first time since the 1890s that the White House has changed parties 3 administrations in a row.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because the system has become increasingly ineffectual at addressing people's real needs. And what happened back in the 1890s is they implemented reforms like the direct election of senators. They implemented party primaries, which prior to then, candidates were chosen by party bosses. Women got the right to vote. They implemented prohibition, can't win them all. But the bottom line is these reformers did a lot in the face of inadequate political and government response to better the situation for people for decades to come.
Mm.
And Sean, normally I like to let you cap it off, but I think I really nailed the dismount on that one. So we're going to end it there. Thank you very much for listening. If you liked what you heard today, be sure to leave us a review, rate the episode, and subscribe for a piping hot episode of Middleweight Politics delivered into your ears every week. That metaphor sounds really painful. Thank you again for listening to Middleweight Politics. Stay purple.